This is a mid-19th century silver pear-cased verge watch. It came to me with a spare bezel, which was originally protecting the dial. I'd already sourced and temporarily fitted this period glass. As you see, the case has got the thumb piece missing. As always, or as often is the case, there's a watch paper inside the back of the case. Let's have a look at the movement. The case is quite tight, so I'm going to use my watch case knife. And we can just pop the glass out because it hasn't been secured yet. I was really lucky to find this glass that was pretty much the correct size. As you can see, a white enamel dial is in good condition, although the tip of the minute hand is missing. Here we have a typical mid-19th century verge watch, signed Charles Clayton, and luckily we see the balance pivots are in good order, but the fusee chain has come unshipped, and this turned out to be the main repair of the watch, in addition to rusting that we see here on the square or the centre arbor. So the first thing to do is to remove the movement from the case, from the inner case, and I've just made a pusher out of blued steel, and we'll just pop out the pin from the joint. Our first component has been liberated. So now the bezel lifts away and the movement is free of the case. We can see the hallmarks there. So I choose a watch holder, movement holder. These are boxwood, they're quite nice, old ones, of the correct size, which will help support the watch movement as we work on it. So the first thing to do is to remove the hands. So I apply a drop of turpentine spirit to begin to free up the rust. Then cut 2 pieces of polyester film to protect the face of the hour hand, and then after a certain amount of encouragement, eventually the minute hand lifts away. The hands are gold, rather nice. As I say, the tip of the minute hand's missing. So the same thing for the hour hand. We apply a drop of turpentine spirit, allow that to soak, and then using our brass tweezers lift the hand away. So far, so good. To remove the dial, we remove these 3 brass taper pins from the dial feet. This one is actually steel and appears to be a little bit corroded. So to protect the plate of the watch, I'm just using a bit of thin card and my cutter pliers to remove. So with the 3 taper pins out, we can now lift the dial and the brass edge away from the movement. And the first thing we see is some more rusting, but also the setup click for the mainspring. It was missing, and we find it here lodged between the back of the dial and the brass edge. So let's just try the correct way around. Ratchet wheel in place. Sorry, it's not the click, it's the ratchet wheel. And you can see that the screw is undone. Now, whether this was the cause of the chain becoming unshipped, we don't know. So remove the hour wheel. This is the wheel that carries the hour hand. The minute wheel, which connects the cannon wheel to the hour wheel, part of the underdial gearing, and then that ratchet wheel for setup of the mainspring that we saw a minute ago. Next I'm going to remove the vulnerable fusee chain, keeping my fingers crossed that the chain isn't actually broken and has both its hooks. It's really important not to twist the chain sideways, so although it looks very kinked here, that is actually absolutely fine. What we don't want are any bends in the chain, sideways bends, and I'll just unhook the barrel hooking here. So this is all quite heartening because the chain is still intact, albeit a bit rusty. You can see as we put the chain in the spirit to begin washing it, it actually floats on the surface of the liquid. Next we remove the balance cock. Of course all the power is off the mainspring and the setup in this case, so this is quite safe. You can see that the balance cock screw is a bit rusty, and we lift the balance cock away from the Potton's plate, taking time to admire this incredible engraving and piercing the grotesque mask. Next we unpin the balance spring using our Savoy tweezers, and can see that the balance spring has got a kink in the end and it's also quite rusty, so that could be problematic in our sort of repair. Rust on the balance rim as well. So gently fish the balance out and we see that the balance spring has been pulled up into a helix, which we'll have to try and straighten in a while. Next we remove the silver regulator dial. This is a Tompion style regulator, and this little engraved dial is actually silver. Swapping back to under dial, we remove the bolt, which has been soaking because it was rather rusty. Again, the turpentine spirit has worked its way into the threads, so we remove the screw and then the rusted bolt. Next, the mainspring setup ratchet click. The screw might be later here. Some of the screws in this watch appear to have been mixed up. This one could be later. And click. So we remove the regulator plate. Screws again were rusted slightly. And as we lift that, we can see the index and the rack and the pinion that drives the rack back and forth to regulate the watch. This watch is owner regulated, and again we can take a minute to admire this incredible engraving and Mercury fire gilt decoration. The cannon pinion, we might lever the cannon pinion up, but in this case again, because of the rust, I want to actually twist the pinion off, so I use brass lined pliers, and again it actually lifts away rather easily. Followed by the bridge for the third wheel and contrate wheel. Again, taking it easy with these slightly rusted screws. Again, this screw as you see is really tight, and of course what I don't want to do is to shear the head of the screw. So in fact, if you tighten the screw very slightly, it can often loosen it. We can now lift off the third wheel contract wheel bridge. It's steady pinned, and you can see here it's a bit reluctant. There we are. No jewels in this watch in the bearings, just plain brass bearings. There's the third wheel with its pinion in good condition. The rusting seems to be quite superficial, which is good. And now we lift out the contract wheel. The contract wheel has the teeth running along the axis of the arbor, unlike the other wheels in the train. So there's our contract wheel with pinion. Again, rust free, so happy outcome there. So we've removed the Potton's plate pins, and we can now lift off the Potton's plate, revealing the fusee on the right, centre wheel and barrel arbor. So just checking the pivots of the crown wheel, we notice that the crown wheel end of the arbor, the bearing hole is quite warm. Checking the fusee stop iron is working properly. Again, a bit more spirit on there to loosen things up. And now we can... The joint on the movement pillar plate was beginning to annoy me, the fact that it was not sitting down on the watch holder. So I'm just going to file a little bit of the watch holder away, which will make life a lot easier. So now we can lift out the barrel. The fusee and the centre wheel. So looking at our fusee and great wheel, I now see that the ratchet mechanism, the winding ratchet, is broken. So let's have a look inside. You can see from the file marks on the face of the great wheel that the watch has had some previous work. So I push the fusee arbor out of the great wheel, lift away the collet, and flipping the great wheel over, we see immediately there's some corrosion product, lack of lubrication, and importantly the winding click, the ratchet click end has actually either broken off or bent round, so the watch may have been wound in the wrong direction. But there's been some failure which has caused the fusee chain hooking to fail. And when we look at the ratchet wheel, the winding ratchet wheel, you can see some green powdery corrosion at the bottom there, and I suspect that for some reason the ratchet wheel has been soldered onto the face of the back of the cone, which is unusual because the wheel should just sit there. So moving back to our Potton's plate, lift out the crown wheel, and then with the screw removed, lift away the Potton's. And as is often or sometimes the case, under the Potton's, again we can see the mercury gilding there just running around the edges, but we can also see the movement caliber maker initials TR. So the person that signed the watch, or had the watch signed, was not the maker of this watch. Now we lift away the barrel cap. Nice graver turning on the inside still. and then we can remove the barrel arbor from the mainspring. So going back to our fusee chain, which has been soaking in spirits, we can begin to loosen up the rusted links at the end. These links are always quite tight, but the rusted ones really need to get some movement into them. So this is a very slow and painstaking job. Can't really be rushed because we don't want to break the chain. So very slowly just introducing some movement to these links. I use these rather inexpensive brass tweezers, and people will see that the ends bend round, so I'm constantly bending them and filing them and so on. But I think they're great for this kind of work. Probably not ideal for the finest work, but they're certainly, I think, much more suited than stainless steel tweezers for this work. This is, remember, not a modern watch with really tiny parts. So this fusee chain is going to take some time to loosen up all the rivets. I'll come back to it after it's soaked for a little longer. So back to our soft soldered winding ratchet wheel, and we can see the solder there. I just scraped a little bit of the corrosion product away with a scalpel. So in order to make this work again, I'm going to remove the wheel with the spirit lamp just to heat the solder, melt the solder. So I've slid a scalpel blade under part of the wheel that was loose. Remember, this whole assembly has already been heated, so this isn't heating it more. This is just returning it to that state. You would never normally want to heat this assembly, but it's been done. And you can see the spirit lamp gives us a nice gentle, or relatively gentle heat. So we've now removed the ratchet wheel. I'm going to brush the ratchet wheel again in the spirit flame with a number 2 Glasgow brush that's been soaked in water to prevent the bristles from burning. This also cools down the work, so it means you can really control the amount of heat rather nicely. We won't get rid of all the solder, of course. There will be a thin layer adhered to the surface of the brass, but we'll get rid of the majority or the mass of it, so the wheel can once again sit flush against the face of the fusee cone. And the same for the cone here, holding the winding arbor in brass line pliers. I speeded up the video because it took a rather long time. I'd rather increase the heat slowly. So with our winding ratchet wheel in place, or at least within the great wheel, we can see that there's no way that that ratchet click is going to work again, regrettably. So our options are to not have the watch winding and have it as a relic, if you like, to try and solder a piece on this click, or to make a new one. And not quite sure it's the right decision, but in the end, from a piece of millimetre thick gauge plate, I made a new one, and here I'm hardening it, so I'll heat it to orange, hold that temperature for about 20 or 30 seconds, and then plunge it into cold water. You can see the steel's coming up to temperature now. So there we are, the temperature we want. It's going to hold it for a little bit till we know that it's soaked, and then we will pop it straight into cold water. Now the click's cooled, and I want to temper the click to remove some of the brittleness. If we were to fit it as it is, there's a chance that the end would break off because it's very hard, but it's also quite brittle. And we moderate that brittleness by tempering the steel. So I'm using a 1000 grit ceramic stone just to get a clean metal surface, and then a piece of scrap brass to again slow the heating. So we're heating to about 300 degrees here. I'm afraid my camera wouldn't focus, but we're heating until that component turns blue, which means that it's tempered. Okay, so the next thing is to replace the pin in the fusee cone. I've already pushed the broken pieces out, made a tapered piece of steel which I've cut off, and now I'm going to grind the end flat so it's nice and flush, and just try the chain on the hooking. Check that the chain can rotate when the watch runs down. Next thing is to get the mainspring out. I didn't have a small enough arbor for my clock mainspring winder, so I made a temporary arbor. You can see it's a bit wobbly, but it does the job. And the spring is in remarkably good condition, the mainspring. So we peg out the barrel, in fact peg out all the bearings in the watch to clean them, as well as washing in spirits and rinsing in spirits too. So on reassembly, we've now got the spring back in the barrel. I'm using Mobius D3 here on the mainspring. I could use D5, which is slightly thicker. This watch probably won't be operated much. You can see the oil there making its way between the coil of the spring. And just reinstalling the barrel arbor. I'll probably have to get hold of the winding of the setup square. There we are. So just winding the barrel arbor back into the core of the mainspring, and it's clicked in place. So click on the barrel cap with fingers, oil the pivots, and I'm looking at this front fusee arbor bearing because it had some corrosion. Did actually deal with that with a pivot file a little bit, but not a lot. Oiling our new click, and now we move on to the balance spring, which I removed from its collet, and I've trapped it between this piece of folded brass and put a steel pin through. And the purpose of the steel pin is to let me judge, as you can see here, when it turns blue, because I know when the pin turns blue, then the spring that's trapped between the two bits of brass will be pretty much at the same temperature. And not bad. Not perfect, but a heck of a lot better than it was when it was pulled up in a helix. Really risky with this spring because it's got clumps of rust on it, so it could easily break. But I think that's flattened reasonably for the type of watch. So everything has been washed and rinsed and pegged out, and we begin our reassembly. So first thing to go back is the Fusey stop iron. Just push the pin in there with our brass tweezers. Check that it's free to move. Now we fit the spring, and again check the spring is working. Tighten the screw. Quite dangerous if the stop iron doesn't work. Can cause a bit of a disaster. Refit the potance and its screw. So I've done some de-rusting with brushes and a little bit of 4/0 steel wool and a hard pencil. Refit the crown wheel, and we can see there it's spinning nice and freely when we give it a puff. Centre wheel back in. Barrel, check everything moves nice and freely, and then our fusee. Pop the Potence plate back on. And then reassemble the regulator, the pinion there, and its rack. Lubricating, of course, as we go along, again with Mobius D3 primarily, and 90-20 on the escape wheel and balance pivots. A little bit of 90-20 here as well. Pop the pinion back. And the regulating rack. So the regulating rack, as it moves backwards and forwards, changes the effective length of the balance spring and therefore the restoring force of the balance spring. And fit the regulating plate or cover. Again, I had a little bit of a fiddle around with the location of the screws in this watch to try and get them where I felt they were a best fit. There we are. It's not absolutely flat, so it doesn't sit perfectly flat. Just got temporary pins in the plate for the time being. So pop the contract wheel back. A little bit fiddly. It's got to be a bit careful with the pivots, fine pivots. There we are. And the third wheel, which is a bit easier. Replace the bridge, third wheel contract wheel bridge. And our mainspring setup, ratchet wheel and click. So I still don't really know which of those things gave out first, whether it was this assembly can't have come undone on its own, so it might have been the pin that wore through or broke on the fusee, but more likely that winding ratchet inside the fusee cone there didn't work and the whole thing recoiled, I guess. So we'll need to apply some setup here once the fusee chain is on, but that's fine for the time being. So with a little bit of setup on the chain, let's just check our new winding ratchet, the moment of truth. Train seems to run smartly and the fusee chain is nicely distributed across the face of the barrel. So we can now pop the balance back with the flattened spring and re-pin. When I first pinned this, the watch was gaining about 20 minutes a day with the regulator in the middle of its travel. So I repinned it and then it was losing about 20 minutes a day. So I repinned it somewhere in the middle, and actually the pendant up rate is about 2 minutes in 24 hours. I don't expect it to maintain that sort of degree of stability, but it's I think as close as we're ever going to get. So with the spring pinned, we can replace the balance cock, check that the pivot is in its hole, of course. Don't want any nasty surprises when we screw the balance cock down. So now the moment of truth. You can wind the watch a little and see whether it runs. So there we are. So the action is tiny compared to a modern wristwatch, of course, but I think, considering there was a question of whether this watch was going to be a relic or not, that's a reasonable result. Just making one new part, the winding ratchet click, and finding or sourcing a new old stock glass. So all that remains now is to make a new spring for the inside of the pear case, and a thumb piece, and recase. We can see a little bit of recoil here on the crown wheel. The watch was running out of beat, and I moved the collet round on the balance on the verge staff. It's still not perfectly in beat. So now time to refit our motion work. Minute wheel goes back on with a bit of oil. Same for the hour wheel. Dial back on. Followed by our hands. Just aligning them to get them at 90 degrees or thereabouts. So once the main watch was finished, I turned a new thumb piece in the watchmaker's lathe, first using the tip of the graver to get the work concentric, then the oblique face of the graver to turn to shape. Periodically I tried the new component against the case and then used blue pen to see where the two components touched for final shaping and trimming. Once I was happy that the new component was a reasonable fit, I used a modified scalpel blade to part off the work, resting it on a cork block to file the back flat, and then fitted it to the spring and filed in a notch for the thumbnail. Final coat of microcrystalline wax to slow the rate of tarnishing a little bit. Then refitted the case liner and watch paper. With this part of the project finished, I then fitted the completed watch into an archival grade box for storage, lined with plastisol foam and some acid-free tissue paper. I returned the original packing and spare bezel to the customer and tied up with some archival book tape. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed that first installation of Reed Repairs. I think this was an interesting object to get us started because it raised some sort of pertinent questions, mainly about what a thing is, which to me is really important and interesting. I think it's reasonable to say that for many people, a watch is a thing that you use or wear. It keeps time, it runs, it's a dynamic object, and so on. And this object was really cool because it demonstrated that a watch can be many things. In fact, it is at any one time, I suppose, multiple things to multiple people, and all those sort of definitions or concepts or understandings of a thing overlap in an interesting and rather complicated way. So when we began the project, we didn't know whether the watch was going to run or not, whether the damage would be so significant that it was beyond my skills, but it happened to be, interestingly, just about on the margin of what I could do, and also maybe on the margin of it becoming a relic or a different kind of object that wasn't a dynamic object per se, and remaining a watch. I don't know really the meaning of the outcome, other than it was an interesting process. Again, for me, one of the most important parts was the representation of the object, the boxing, and that kind of thing, because it demonstrated that if we simply represent an object without actually carrying out any intervention per se, again, other than thinking, the thing changes. So the watch has now gone back to its owner, and it starts another chapter in its life, if you like. I think one important element to this project is to demonstrate that things can be repaired. We live in the era of the right to repair movement, and of course I would always encourage people to get started. A watch like this, the components are quite small and can easily be damaged, so it's maybe not the best place to begin, but you saw, other than the watchmaker's lathe for turning the thumb piece, that the tools involved are actually quite modest. Screwdrivers, a pair of tweezers, some solvents, brushes, a bit of oil, and so on. So I hope that's encouragement to think about getting started, whether it's for the well-being benefits of repairing a thing, whether it's to begin a new craft or hobby, or whether it's the first steps of professional practice. I would always encourage people to have a go and get started. So that's all for me for now. We'll be back soon with another video with a different kind of object, and very happy to discuss and expand on the topics raised. Thank you.